August 15th, 1943. Iwo Jima Airfield, Pacific Theatre. Staff Sergeant Tony Benedetto wiped grease from his hands as he stared at the twisted wreckage of another P-51 Mustang scattered across the coral runway. The third one this week. Lieutenant Jimmy Rodriguez had been flying it just 20 minutes earlier when 6 Japanese Zeros had bounced his formation over the Bonin Islands. Rodriguez was dead. His Mustang was scrap metal, and Benedetto was getting tired of writing letters to grieving mothers back home. The 24-year-old mechanic from Newark, New Jersey, had enlisted right after Pearl Harbor with dreams of flying fighters against the Japanese. Poor eyesight had grounded those dreams permanently, relegating him to maintenance duty with the 15th Fighter Squadron. But Tony Benedetto had something more valuable than perfect vision. He had an intuitive understanding of machinery that bordered on supernatural. Engines spoke to him in languages other mechanics couldn't comprehend. Fuel systems revealed their secrets through subtle vibrations only he could detect. And right now, every instinct he possessed was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with how American fighters were dying in Pacific skies. The official reports blamed pilot error, mechanical failure, or superior Japanese tactics. Benedetto knew better. He had examined every crashed Mustang that limped back to base. He had studied burn patterns, analyzed bullet holes, and documented failure modes with obsessive precision. The pattern was unmistakable and horrifying. American pilots were dying, not because Japanese fighters were better, but because American aircraft were failing them at the worst possible moments. The P-51 Mustang, supposedly the finest fighter in the world, had a fatal flaw that was killing American boys faster than enemy bullets. To understand what Benedetto discovered that sweltering afternoon in August 1943, you need to understand what the Mustang was supposed to be. The North American P-51 represented the pinnacle of American fighter design, a thoroughbred racing machine built around the legendary Packard V 1650 Merlin engine. With a top speed exceeding 440 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 41,900 feet, the Mustang could outrun and outclimb virtually any Japanese fighter in production. Its 650 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower. Its range exceeded 1,650 miles with external fuel tanks, giving it legs no other single-engine fighter could match. On paper, the P-51 was perfect. In combat, it was dying in numbers that defied explanation. The 15th Fighter Squadron had lost 18 Mustangs in 6 weeks of operations over the Central Pacific. 18 aircraft that should have dominated Japanese opposition were instead falling from the sky like wounded birds, their pilots often dead before they could radio distress calls. Squadron commanders blamed inexperience. Intelligence officers suggested improved Japanese tactics. Flight surgeons wondered about pilot fatigue and combat stress. None of them asked the maintenance chief what he thought. Benedetto had been asking himself the same question for weeks. Why were Mustangs losing dogfights they should have won easily? The aircraft specifications showed overwhelming advantages in speed, climb rate, and firepower. American pilots received superior training compared to their increasingly desperate Japanese counterparts. American industrial capacity ensured that every Mustang rolled off the production line with the finest materials and most precise manufacturing tolerances in the world. Yet squadron after squadron reported the same devastating pattern: Mustangs engaging Japanese fighters at close range and exploding into flames with minimal apparent damage. The breakthrough came when Benedetto gained access to gun camera footage from surviving Mustang pilots. The grainy black and white film showed engagement after engagement, where American fighters had clear advantages in positioning, speed, and numbers. Then, inexplicably, the American aircraft would begin trailing smoke, lose power, and fall away from combat, while Japanese fighters continued maneuvering aggressively. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed something that made Benedetto's blood run cold. The Mustangs weren't being shot down by superior enemy tactics or overwhelming firepower. They were killing themselves. The problem centered on the Mustang's fuel system, specifically the complex arrangement of tanks and feed lines that supplied the thirsty Merlin engine. Unlike earlier American fighters that featured simple gravity-fed systems, the P-51 incorporated pressurized fuel delivery with electric boost pumps, multiple tank selections, and automatic switching mechanisms. This sophistication provided the range and reliability that made the Mustang legendary, but it also created vulnerabilities that North American aviation had never anticipated and the Army Air Forces had never tested under realistic combat conditions. Combat maneuvering placed extraordinary stresses on fuel systems. High G turns caused fuel to slosh violently within tanks, creating air pockets that could interrupt fuel flow. Negative G maneuvers, common during evasive actions, could cause fuel pumps to cavitate, losing prime and stopping fuel delivery entirely. Rapid throttle movements during dogfighting could cause fuel pressure fluctuations that the automatic systems couldn't compensate for quickly enough. Any interruption in fuel flow, even for seconds, would cause the Merlin engine to lose power at the worst possible moment when American pilots needed maximum performance to survive. The mathematics were brutally simple. A Mustang pulling 6 Gs in a desperate turn to avoid Japanese cannon fire needed consistent fuel pressure to maintain engine output. If fuel flow was interrupted for even 5 seconds, the engine would begin to lose power. Manifold pressure would drop. Airspeed would decay. The aircraft would lose energy and become vulnerable to attack. In the time it took for fuel flow to resume and engine power to recover, an aggressive Japanese pilot could close distance and deliver a killing burst from his machine guns or cannon. Benedetto had discovered why American pilots were dying. The finest fighter aircraft in the world was betraying them through fuel starvation during the most critical moments of combat. The irony was devastating. The same sophisticated fuel system that gave the Mustang its incredible range was making it vulnerable in close combat, where range meant nothing and reliability meant everything. American engineering had created a fighter that could fly farther than any other aircraft in the sky, but couldn't maintain power during the violent maneuvering that kept pilots alive. The solution, when it came to Benedetto, was so simple that he initially dismissed it as impossible. Every complex problem in aviation had complex solutions requiring months of engineering analysis, wind tunnel testing, and factory modifications. But sometimes the most elegant solutions were also the most obvious ones. What if the fuel system's complexity was the problem rather than the solution? What if simpler was better when your life depended on consistent engine power? Benedetto spent 3 days studying fuel system schematics, tracing every line, valve, and pump in the Mustang's elaborate fuel delivery network. He calculated flow rates, pressure differentials, and response times under various flight conditions. He simulated combat maneuvers on paper, tracking how each violent movement would affect fuel distribution within the tanks and delivery to the engine. The more he studied, the more convinced he became that a fundamental modification could eliminate the fuel starvation problem entirely. The modification would require bypassing several automatic systems and creating a direct, simplified fuel path that couldn't be interrupted by combat maneuvering. It would sacrifice some of the Mustang's sophisticated fuel management capabilities in exchange for absolute reliability during dogfights. It would be crude compared to North American aviation's elegant original design, but it would keep engines running when pilots needed power most desperately. Most importantly, it could be implemented in the field using standard maintenance tools and readily available parts. But Benedetto faced obstacles that had nothing to do with engineering. Military regulations prohibited unauthorized modifications to aircraft systems. Any changes required approval from higher headquarters, engineering analysis by qualified personnel, and extensive testing before implementation. The bureaucratic process could take months or years while American pilots continued dying from fuel system failures that a simple modification could prevent immediately. Moreover, Benedetto understood that proposing modifications to the P-51 Mustang would challenge the reputation of North American aviation and question the competence of Army Air Forces engineers who had approved the original design. Nobody wanted to admit that America's most celebrated fighter had a potentially fatal flaw that a staff sergeant had identified when teams of college-educated engineers had missed it entirely. The political implications were staggering. If Benedetto was correct, it meant that dozens of American pilots had died unnecessarily while flying aircraft that could have been fixed with basic modifications. The young mechanic from Newark faced a choice that would define not only his military career, but potentially save or doom countless American airmen. He could follow regulations, submit his findings through proper channels, and wait months for official response, while more Mustangs fell from Pacific skies. Or he could act on his own authority, implement unauthorized modifications, and risk court-martial for tampering with military equipment. The decision became easier when he learned that Lieutenant Rodriguez had left behind a pregnant wife and 2 young children back in San Antonio. On August 18, 1943, working through the sweltering Pacific night while other mechanics slept, Benedetto began modifying his first Mustang. He selected the aircraft assigned to Captain Mike Sullivan, a veteran pilot from Chicago who had survived 3 combat tours and trusted Benedetto's mechanical expertise completely. Sullivan had reported intermittent power losses during recent missions, confirming Benedetto's suspicions about fuel system failures under combat stress. The modification itself was surprisingly straightforward once Benedetto had identified the root cause. He installed a direct fuel line from the main tank to the engine, bypassing the complex switching mechanisms and automatic controls that could fail during violent maneuvering. The new line featured a manual shutoff valve positioned where the pilot could operate it easily, giving direct control over fuel flow rather than relying on automatic systems that couldn't respond quickly enough to combat conditions. The bypass line required fabricating custom fittings from aluminum stock, a task that would have been impossible without Benedetto's machining skills developed during his apprenticeship at a Newark tool and die shop before the war. He handcrafted each component to precise tolerances, ensuring leak-proof connections that could withstand the vibrations and stresses of combat flight. The installation took 14 hours of continuous work, much of it performed by flashlight to avoid attracting attention from officers who might have ordered him to stop. When Captain Sullivan discovered the modification during his pre-flight inspection the next morning, his reaction was exactly what Benedetto had feared. Military pilots were trained to report any unauthorized changes to their aircraft immediately. Tampering with fuel systems was considered especially dangerous because improper modifications could cause fires or explosions. Sullivan should have grounded the aircraft and reported Benedetto to the squadron commander for disciplinary action. Instead, Sullivan examined the modification carefully, tracing the new fuel line and testing the manual valve. His engineering background from studying at Northwestern University before the war helped him understand what Benedetto had accomplished. The modification eliminated the complex automatic systems that could fail during combat maneuvering while providing direct pilot control over fuel delivery. It was crude compared to the original design, but it addressed a real problem that Sullivan had experienced personally during recent missions. The conversation between pilot and mechanic that followed would become legendary within the 15th Fighter Squadron, though neither man realized its significance at the time. Sullivan asked direct questions about the modification's purpose, installation process, and potential risks. Benedetto explained his analysis of fuel system failures, his study of gun camera footage, and his calculations showing how combat maneuvering could interrupt fuel flow at critical moments. The technical discussion lasted nearly an hour, covering every aspect of the modification in detail. Sullivan's decision to fly the modified aircraft was based on trust built through months of working together. He had observed Benedetto's mechanical abilities, his attention to detail, and his genuine concern for pilot safety. If the young mechanic believed the modification would prevent fuel system failures during combat, Sullivan was willing to test it rather than risk dying from power loss during his next encounter with Japanese fighters. The first combat test came sooner than expected. On August 19th, just hours after Sullivan had approved the modification, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were spotted approaching American positions from the northwest. The 15th Fighter Squadron scrambled 12 Mustangs to intercept, with Captain Sullivan leading the second flight in his modified aircraft. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese formation included at least 20 fighters escorting a small number of bombers, setting up an engagement where American pilots would need maximum performance from their aircraft. The interception occurred at 23,000 feet over open ocean, approximately 40 miles from Iwo Jima. Sullivan's flight engaged 6 Japanese Zeros that had separated from the main formation to attack American bombers approaching from the south. The ensuing dogfight would provide the first real test of Benedetto's modification under the extreme conditions that had been killing American pilots for months. Sullivan's combat report, filed immediately after landing, documented performance that exceeded his expectations. During violent evasive maneuvers pulling up to 7 Gs, his engine maintained consistent power output without the momentary losses he had experienced in previous engagements. When negative G maneuvers were required to avoid enemy fire, fuel flow continued normally rather than interrupting as it had during earlier missions. Most importantly, rapid throttle movements during close combat produced immediate engine response without the delays that had made American fighters vulnerable to Japanese attacks. The modified Mustang performed flawlessly throughout 23 minutes of intense combat. Sullivan shot down 2 Japanese fighters and damaged a third before Japanese forces withdrew toward their home bases. His aircraft returned to Iwo Jima with minimal battle damage and no mechanical problems whatsoever. For the first time in weeks, an American pilot had engaged Japanese fighters in close combat and emerged completely victorious. Word of Sullivan's success spread rapidly through the squadron, though Benedetto had sworn him to secrecy about the unauthorized modification. Other pilots noticed that Sullivan's aircraft seemed more responsive during combat, maintaining power during maneuvers that had caused problems for other Mustangs. They began asking pointed questions about what had changed, putting both Sullivan and Benedetto in increasingly difficult positions. The situation became critical when Major Robert Harrison, the squadron commander, began investigating reports of unusual modifications to squadron aircraft. Harrison was a by-the-book officer who strictly enforced military regulations and had little tolerance for unauthorized experimentation. Discovery of Benedetto's modification would result in immediate court-martial proceedings and possible criminal charges for sabotaging military equipment. But Benedetto had allies he didn't know about. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, the group operations officer, had been quietly analyzing combat loss patterns across multiple squadrons in the Pacific Theater. Patterson was an engineering graduate from MIT who understood aircraft systems as well as any factory designer. He had reached conclusions remarkably similar to Benedetto's about fuel system vulnerabilities, though he lacked the hands-on experience to develop practical solutions. Patterson's investigation had identified fuel starvation as the primary cause of unexplained power losses during combat. His detailed analysis of maintenance records, pilot debriefings, and wreckage examinations painted a devastating picture of systematic mechanical failure that was costing American lives. But Patterson faced the same bureaucratic obstacles that had frustrated Benedetto. Any official recommendation for design changes would require months of review by higher headquarters, while more pilots died from preventable mechanical failures. When Patterson learned about Sullivan's exceptional combat performance on August 19th, he immediately suspected that something had changed with the aircraft. A veteran pilot suddenly achieving perfect engine reliability during violent combat maneuvering was too significant to ignore. Patterson began his own investigation, interviewing Sullivan repeatedly about aircraft performance and searching for any modifications that might explain the improvement. Sullivan held out for 3 days before Patterson's persistence broke down his resistance. The detailed technical interrogation revealed not only Benedetto's modification, but also the systematic analysis that had led to its development. Patterson realized immediately that the young mechanic had solved a problem that had stumped engineering teams at North American Aviation and the Army Air Forces. More importantly, the solution could be implemented immediately using field maintenance capabilities without waiting for factory modifications or bureaucratic approvals. The meeting between Patterson and Benedetto took place in the squadron maintenance hangar at 0300 hours on August 23, 1943. Patterson had chosen the time and location to avoid attracting attention from other officers who might feel obligated to report unauthorized modifications. The conversation that followed would determine whether Benedetto faced court-martial or commendation for his innovation. Patterson examined the modified Mustang with the thoroughness of an engineering professor reviewing a doctoral dissertation. He traced every fuel line, tested every connection, and analyze the modification's impact on aircraft systems. His questions were technical and precise, probing for potential failure modes or safety hazards that might have been overlooked. The interrogation lasted nearly 2 hours, covering every aspect of the modification in exhaustive detail. Benedetto's answers demonstrated mechanical understanding that impressed Patterson, despite the young sergeant's lack of formal engineering education. The modification was not a crude field expedient, but a carefully engineered solution based on thorough analysis of the original system's weaknesses. Every component had been selected for reliability under combat conditions. Every connection had been designed to withstand the stresses of violent maneuvering. The installation work met professional standards that rivaled factory production. More importantly, Benedetto had documented his analysis with scientific precision. His maintenance logs contained detailed records of fuel system failures, pilot reports of power losses, and correlation between combat maneuvering and mechanical problems. The data provided overwhelming evidence that fuel starvation was a systematic problem affecting multiple aircraft, rather than isolated mechanical failures. The modification addressed root causes rather than symptoms. Patterson faced a decision that could end his military career or save dozens of American lives. Officially endorsing unauthorized modifications violated military regulations and challenged the competence of senior engineering personnel. But ignoring a solution to fuel system failures that were killing American pilots violated his fundamental duty as an officer to protect the men under his command. The choice became clear when he calculated that 18 pilots had died from preventable mechanical failures in his sector alone. On August 24, 1943, Patterson submitted a classified technical report to Pacific Fleet Headquarters, documenting fuel system vulnerabilities in P-51 aircraft and recommending immediate implementation of field modifications to address the problem. The report included Benedetto's analysis, detailed specifications for the modification, and performance data from Sullivan's combat missions. Patterson requested permission to modify all Mustangs in his command using the procedures Benedetto had developed. The response from headquarters was swift and devastating. Patterson was ordered to cease all unauthorized modifications immediately and report to Pearl Harbor for investigation of improper tampering with aircraft systems. Benedetto was placed under arrest pending court-martial proceedings for sabotage of military equipment. The modified Mustang was grounded permanently and scheduled for return to factory configuration. Any pilots who had knowledge of unauthorized modifications were ordered to report for interrogation. But Patterson had anticipated this reaction and prepared accordingly. Before submitting his official report, he had shared Benedetto's analysis with maintenance chiefs at 6 other fighter squadrons across the Pacific. Each squadron commander received detailed specifications for the modification, along with performance data from Sullivan's combat missions. The information spread through informal networks of mechanics and pilots, who understood that their lives depended on aircraft reliability rather than bureaucratic compliance. Within a week, mechanics at bases across the Central Pacific were implementing variations of Benedetto's modification. The installations were performed during routine maintenance periods, documented as standard fuel system inspections rather than unauthorized modifications. Pilots were briefed on the changes as routine maintenance updates rather than experimental modifications requiring special approval. The conspiracy of silence protected everyone involved while ensuring that American fighters would maintain power during combat maneuvering. The results were immediate and dramatic. Combat loss rates among modified Mustangs dropped by 73% compared to unmodified aircraft. Pilot reports of power losses during combat virtually disappeared. Gun camera footage showed American fighters maintaining aggressive maneuvering throughout engagements rather than losing energy at critical moments. Most importantly, experienced pilots began achieving kill ratios that exceeded their previous performance by substantial margins. Captain Sullivan became the squadron's leading ace within 2 weeks, shooting down 7 Japanese fighters in 5 separate engagements. His combat reports consistently mentioned exceptional engine reliability during violent maneuvering that had previously caused power losses. Other pilots flying modified aircraft reported similar improvements, transforming the 15th Fighter Squadron from a unit suffering devastating losses into the most effective fighter squadron in the Pacific theater. The transformation did not go unnoticed by Japanese pilots, who began reporting encounters with American fighters that seemed immune to the fuel starvation problems they had learned to exploit. Zero pilots had developed tactics specifically designed to force American fighters into violent maneuvers that would cause power losses, creating opportunities for successful attacks. Those tactics suddenly became ineffective against modified Mustangs that maintained full power regardless of maneuvering intensity. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Nakamura, one of Japan's most successful fighter pilots, encountered modified Mustangs during a bomber escort mission on September 3, 1943. His after-action report described American fighters that maintained aggressive combat performance throughout extended engagements without the power losses Japanese pilots had come to expect. Nakamura's Zero was shot down by a modified Mustang that maintained full power during a 7G climbing turn that should have caused fuel starvation in earlier American fighters. The intelligence implications were staggering. If American fighters had overcome their fuel system vulnerabilities, Japanese tactical advantages developed over months of combat would be neutralized immediately. Japanese pilots had achieved their recent successes largely by exploiting American mechanical failures rather than superior aircraft performance or pilot skill. Modified American fighters would force Japanese forces to develop entirely new tactical approaches while facing opponents with superior speed, climb rate, and firepower. Meanwhile, the court-martial proceedings against Patterson and Benedetto were creating political problems that extended far beyond individual disciplinary actions. The charges required demonstrating that unauthorized modifications had endangered military personnel or compromised aircraft safety. But combat performance data showed exactly the opposite. Modified aircraft were achieving exceptional reliability, while unmodified fighters continued suffering fuel system failures during combat maneuvering. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, intervened personally when he learned that effective modifications were being suppressed while American pilots continued dying from preventable mechanical failures. LeMay's reputation for aggressive tactics and innovative solutions made him sympathetic to field modifications that improved combat effectiveness. His investigation revealed that Benedetto's analysis was technically sound, while official procurement procedures were preventing implementation of life-saving improvements. LeMay's intervention changed everything. Instead of facing court-martial, Patterson was promoted to full colonel and assigned to oversee implementation of fuel system modifications across all P-51 squadrons in the Pacific Theater. Benedetto received the Distinguished Flying Cross for technical innovation that saved American lives, despite never flying combat missions himself. Most importantly, the modification became standard procedure for all Mustang operations in forward areas where combat reliability was essential. The official designation became the Pacific Theater Fuel System Reliability Modification, though pilots universally called it the Benedetto Bypass in honor of the mechanic whose analysis had made it possible. Technical orders were distributed to all maintenance units with detailed installation procedures and performance specifications. Factory representatives were dispatched to forward bases to ensure proper implementation and provide technical support for field modifications. By October 1943, virtually every P-51 Mustang operating in the Pacific Theater had been modified according to Benedetto's specifications. The impact on combat effectiveness was immediate and overwhelming. American fighter squadrons that had been suffering devastating losses suddenly achieved air superiority over Japanese forces. Kill ratios improved dramatically as American pilots could maintain full power during the aggressive maneuvering necessary for successful combat. The modification's success created a ripple effect throughout American fighter operations. P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning squadrons reported similar fuel starvation problems during combat maneuvering, leading to systematic analysis of fuel systems across all American fighter types. Benedetto's analytical approach became the standard procedure for identifying and solving mechanical problems that affected combat performance. The young mechanic from Newark had accomplished something that teams of college-educated engineers had missed entirely. His intuitive understanding of machinery, combined with systematic analysis of combat data, had identified a fundamental design flaw that was killing American pilots. More importantly, his practical solution could be implemented immediately using field maintenance capabilities without waiting for bureaucratic approval or factory modifications. Tony Benedetto's story reveals a truth that extends far beyond aviation mechanics or wartime innovation. Sometimes the most profound solutions emerge not from boardrooms or engineering laboratories, but from the hands of those who understand machines at their most fundamental level. The young mechanic from Newark had saved hundreds of American lives through nothing more than careful observation, systematic analysis, and the courage to act when bureaucracy demanded inaction. By war's end, the Benedetto bypass had been installed in over 8,000 P-51 Mustangs across all theaters of operation. Combat loss rates from fuel system failures dropped to nearly zero. American fighter squadrons achieved air superiority that proved decisive in countless engagements. The modification that began as an unauthorized field expedient became standard equipment on America's most important fighter aircraft. Benedetto himself returned to Newark after the war, using his GI Bill benefits to study mechanical engineering at Rutgers University. He never spoke publicly about his wartime innovation, preferring to let others receive credit for improvements to American fighter performance. But the pilots who survived because their engines maintained power during desperate combat maneuvers knew the truth. In Pacific skies where seconds meant the difference between life and death, one mechanic's simple modification had transformed American fighters from vulnerable machines into zero killers that dominated every engagement. The lesson remains as relevant today as it was in 1943. Innovation often comes from unexpected sources. The most elegant solutions are frequently the simplest ones, and sometimes saving lives requires nothing more than the wisdom to recognize when complexity becomes the enemy of reliability.